This is the second of a series of 4 meetings on spiritual awakening as service to the world. So after the last one, Doug sent me some questions he thought it might be good for me to speak to. And first one, which is a very good question, is what is spiritual awakening? And that certainly is a relevant topic since this is about spiritual awakening and service to the world. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story. I've always been very much interested in science, and in my freshman year of college, I went to Caltech, which is like the science school. I mean, just incredible place for learning about science. And I thought, well, by the time I get done with this and whatever training I get after this, I have the tools to be able to try to find the answers to any question that I can think of that has to do with the universe. And before school even started, I wandered over into the bookstore and I bought this little book called Gödel's Theorem. Some of you may have heard of Gödel. He was a philosopher and a mathematician. And this was a very easy to understand conceptual proof, logic proof. And basically what he proved is if you have any system with a set of axioms, axioms are fundamental assumptions. Like for arithmetic, it's just a given that if you have 2 numbers, A and B, A equals A plus B equals B plus A, and so on, A times B equals B times A. Well, not terribly interesting. But what he proved is if you have a system that is at least as interesting as that, that there will always be a statement that you can make that makes perfect sense, but from the axioms that you already have, you can't prove whether it's true or whether it's false. And this just really set some light bulbs off in me, because here logic had proven that it was logically impossible for there ever to be a consistent theory that would explain everything, because there would always be something that you couldn't know whether it was true or false. You just had to assume it was true and go on from there, or assume that it was false and go on from there. But I thought, wait a minute, reality is the way that it is. It's got to either be one or the other. Well, it turns out not to be the case. And that set me off wanting to find out if there were other ways of knowing besides the typical Western way of knowing, which is logic, and it's usually based on, at least before quantum physics came along, a dualistic way of relating to whatever it is that you're experiencing. And I started getting interested in learning about Eastern religions, particularly yoga, and yoga much more than how people usually think of it being the physical postures, but yoga is a whole system of meditation, all kinds of practices, and philosophy and Buddhism and so on. And I learned that people had been exploring for thousands of years different ways of working with consciousness to be able to have a direct experience of whatever it is that you're wanting to know about. But it's not the way that we usually think about knowing something. So if you're the scientist in the laboratory, you would think about if someone gave you some unknown chemical, you think, well, I'm going to run all these tests on it and put it through the mass spectrometer and so on, and learn the molecular structure, maybe even under the electron microscope, and then I'll know all about what this thing is. But this way of knowing was a way of having direct experience, which was not involving a separated dualistic state of consciousness, which is difficult for us to comprehend in our usual way of thinking about things. So I looked up the dictionary definition of what spiritual is, and what it said is spiritual means relating to the human spirit as opposed to material or physical things. Well, what does that mean? It means relating, I take it as it means a way of relating to existence that is beyond the usual world of the physical senses, the usual way of the separated researcher studying something and analyzing something, but also a way of relating that's beyond our normal way of thinking about whatever it is that we're experiencing. And we don't usually think about that very much because it's going on all the time. So we never have a direct experience of what we think of as reality. It's filtered through our physical senses. So even for vision, it's translated in the brain. The electrical impulses are translated into an image that's generated. And that's our perception, that we're having a direct experience of what we see, but we're really having a recreation of what we see. And the same thing with any of the physical senses. But at least I wanted to think, well, there has to be some objective reality out there. I want to be able to get to it. Well, this has been a philosophical quandary for centuries of, is there such a thing as an objective reality? And quantum physics is arriving at sometimes concluding that things do not have a reality unless they're observed. So at least for subatomic particles, you know, in the old days of like what we learned about in high school chemistry and physics, of the little solar system model with the little electrons going in orbits around the nucleus and so on, is not at all corresponding to the way that electrons are. And electrons, until they're measured, are actually described as a probability wave that could be literally anywhere in the universe. But there's more probability they'll be at some locations than other. And it's not until we make a measurement or an observation that we force what's called a collapse of the quantum wave function. And then we can say something about what it is that we're measuring. But until we do that, everything exists in a state of probability, not definite formation in the way that we usually think about things. So back to the notion of, well, what does awakening mean? Well, one way that we can think about what awakening is getting beyond the mass assumption that virtually everybody has, unless they have had some spontaneous experiences or have pursued a course of spiritual study, has, of assuming that the world is the way that they think it is, and that the world is the way that they perceive it is. And if you talk to most people, they would look at you funny and go, well, how could it possibly be anything else than that? I know what I see. Well, you probably know that our physical senses, our visual capacity, we only perceive a teeny slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. In fact, some animals can perceive ultraviolet light, such as bumblebees, and some animals can perceive infrared. We can't perceive those things. So as far as we're concerned, that's not part of our reality. But if you were a snake, a bat, a bumblebee, the world would appear very different than it does to us. Similarly, when we look out into the night sky, even if you're fortunate enough to get away from city lights and you can see just countless stars and the Milky Way and so on, our assumption is, well, if I had just a powerful enough light-based telescope, then I'd be able to take a look at everything that's out there. Well, now astronomers have infrared telescopes and radio telescopes and X-ray telescopes, and they can make a simulation of what things look like through that modality, and the universe looks totally different than it does through just the ordinary frequencies of light. Some of you may have heard of dark matter and dark energy. What we know about the physical universe only accounts for 4% of what's out there. And the other 96% is thought to be a combination of dark matter and dark energy. So think about that. 1/25 of what's out in the universe is something that we have no idea what it is, although there have been maps made through computer simulations of what the structure of dark matter and dark energy looks like. And it looks like this incredible lattice of energy that just goes all over the place. It's like a multidimensional spider web that underlies the structure on which galaxies arise out of. And so that's an awakening, just realizing that much, that the actual universe is so much more than what comes in the world of the senses. But then if we look at what mystics of different traditions have been talking about for eons, who describe subtle realms of reality uh, that have very different properties than ordinary physical reality, and the descriptions are generally couched in the tradition in which a particular mystic arose from. So if they're a Christian mystic, it's going to be couched in terms of Christian symbols and so on, or a Buddhist or a Hindu and so on. But they're all really trying to describe something that is pretty much impossible to put into words, so they can give us metaphors about it, or parables, or stories, or they say it's like such and such. And then you might think, well, I'm a rational person. I don't really believe in this subtle reality business. I can't see it. I can't feel it. So why should I believe that it even exists? Well, I'll give you a couple answers to that. One is that in physics, the current theories, if you're familiar with string theory, one theory is that to have a theory that reconciles gravity and other quantum phenomena, you need the universe to have 10 dimensions. Well, our universe we're familiar with has 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. They're talking about 10. And if that's not enough to boggle your mind, other string theorists say, no, there has to be 21 dimensions. Well, where in the world are these other dimensions? They say they're curled up on each other, so they're very small, so they're outside our realm of perception. And then you might think, okay, well, these are nice theories. Where's the evidence for this? Well, I mentioned in the first call last week, if you were on it or watched the video of it, that it's pretty likely in the next few years there's going to be evidence that higher dimensions exist from the large particle colliders. Will produce reactions that can't be explained by just taking place in the ordinary dimensions we're familiar with. So there's one door that you could enter into. Well, there must be more to this puzzle than I realized. But the other door, I just mentioned this researcher who is a retired professor from Stanford University named William Tiller. And if you Google him, you'll get to his website, and there's just all kinds of research papers on there. And if you go to Amazon, I think he's got at least 4 books he's written about his research with subtle energy. And his research has been replicated. It's very well controlled. And one of the most famous studies that he did is he took a little bit of inert circuitry. So this isn't exactly what he did, but it's kind of analogous. So imagine you cut out a square inch of an old computer circuit board and you set it in the middle of a table, and you got 3 of your friends who are also experienced meditators like you are, and you put an intention. Your instructions are, well, let's put an intention into this little bit of inert circuitry that's not connected to anything, such that when we ship it to a laboratory, could be on the other side of the world, where all the equipment is automated, and the equipment is measuring the pH in a beaker of water. And the intention is that it's going to raise the pH of that water by 1 point, which is a significant amount of change. And sure enough, they do this. They send the circuit board a little bit off to the lab. The equipment's all automated. And over a period of about 3 days, the pH of that water, and there's no physical contact with the circuit board. And even if there was, there's no known ordinary phenomena by which this inert circuit board could raise the pH of water by 1 point. But sure enough, it does that. Well, that's already remarkable enough. It demonstrates that just consciousness somehow has been imprinted on some circuitry and had an effect at a distance on the pH of water. Well, that shouldn't be able to happen. That shouldn't be possible. But that's not the most amazing thing. The most amazing thing is that the entropy is the degree of order or disorder. So when entropy increases, there's more disorder. So if you have something that's hot, it's going to cool off. It's going to, if you have different systems tend to just run down over time or become more disorderly. But what happened in the room that this little bit of circuit board was put into, the entropy actually decreased. There was more order. That's impossible according to the usual laws of physics. The second law of thermodynamics says that entropy is always going to increase, but it decreased. And the term for this is negentropy. And so this is just mind-boggling to anybody, including conventional physicists. And I was at a presentation that William Tiller gave at a conference, and he recalled the time that he was at a conference of physicists, and he was on a panel, and with him was a very well-respected traditional conservative physicist, and Tiller just finished presenting his research, and the traditional physicist turned to Tiller and said, even if what you say is true, I don't believe it. So it was like that he couldn't, the other physicists couldn't conceive that this was true because it was so contrary to what he'd put his whole life into exploring and assuming. So there's a term called scientism, and it's the scientific equivalent of fundamentalism. It's like having a dogmatic belief system that is very resistant to change regardless of what evidence is presented to the contrary. But if you look at Tiller's works, he's done so many different kinds of experiments, and his explanation for this is that whenever you have something that brings about a connection between a subtle energy state and what he calls ordinary reality, that there's an additional contribution to the usual equations of the physics that we're familiar with, and now things are possible, such as entropy decreasing, that weren't possible before. And I majored in math at Stanford. I can't understand half the math in his descriptions, but his research, I can't argue with the conclusions. I mean, it's very solid research, and it's opening up a whole different way of exploring things that I think are going to give a lot of insights. So we could say that awakening, one aspect of awakening is, first of all, just realizing that your assumptions about the way that existence is and the way that the world is perhaps have not been true at all. No matter how firmly you've come to believe it, no matter how much it's correlated with your experience throughout your life, that there's evidence coming from different ways now. Another one is, I'll cite a few other examples. There's something called a Faraday cage, which is a kind of a metal kind of casing that you can put something in, and no known form of electromagnetic energy can penetrate through that. And so they took two people and they put one of them in this Faraday cage in another room, and they measured both people's brain waves, and the people's brain waves got in sync with each other, even though one of them was in this Faraday cage. So even if there was some transmission through the air, through any known means of electromagnetic energy, it couldn't have gotten through this Faraday cage, but the brain waves synced up. So there's some phenomena of energy that isn't dependent on our usual way of understanding things. There's a French scientist, I'm sure I'm pronouncing his name incorrectly, but it's spelled P-E-O-C-H, Pioch. And if you Google him and chicken robot experiment, he's got a paper describing research he's done with chickens and robots. And don't ask me how he got the idea to do this, but the research is fascinating. And one experiment that he did is he imprinted some newly hatched chickens with this mechanical robot, and all this robot would do is, it was controlled by a random number generator. It would just move randomly around the room. Well, this part's not remarkable. Newly hatched chickens are going to follow the first moving thing they see and think that it's their mother, right? So the little chicks were following this robot around. But then they put all the chickens in a clear cage in a corner of the room, and they put the robot that the chickens had imprinted with in the middle, and the robot spent I think it was about 2/3 as much time in the section of the room where the chickens were than in the rest of the room. Pretty strange, huh? And they did the same experiment where they put some chickens that hadn't been imprinted with the robot in the clear cage and put the robot in the middle, and the robot just wandered randomly around the room. So it only happened if there'd been an imprint. Well, you can come up with your own explanation for how this could be, but the only ones I can think of are pretty mind-boggling. One is that the chickens have psychic abilities to control the random number generator to cause the computer to generate random numbers that's going to make the robot wander their way. Well, that's pretty hard to swallow. And the other one is that the robot somehow had a consciousness and knew that its babies were over there and it wanted to be with them. Well, neither one of those make much sense, but you can see if you can come up with another one. He did another experiment where he took some chickens that had never been imprinted with the robot and put them in behind a clear cage in a dark room. And chickens don't like to be in the dark during the daytime. And they put a lighted candle, so the robot was carrying this lighted candle in the middle of the room, and it spent, I think, 71% more time in the area where the chickens were, and it had never been imprinted with these chickens, than it did in the rest of the room. Okay, so that isn't enough to boggle your mind. If you look up Roger Nelson, he was in the engineering department at Princeton University for many years, and he did a lot of research and is continuing to do research with random number generating computers. And one batch of experiments that he did is he had many, many people come to his laboratory, and the only instructions they had was to sit with the random number generator and try to make it deviate significantly from randomness. Well, it turned out that most people were able to do that. Well, that shouldn't be possible. How can consciousness change a random number generator? But they did. And even more remarkable, let's imagine that he collected data yesterday and stored it on a computer and nobody's looked at it. It hasn't been printed out, still in the hard drive. And he brings one of you into the lab today, and your instruction is to see if you can alter the output from yesterday between 2 and 3 in the afternoon so it's no longer random. And sure enough, then when they analyze the data, that would be the only time of day, the previous day, where the data deviated from being random. Well, this is really mind-boggling because it had already been done. How could you change something that's already been done? It's stored on this hard drive, but that's what happened. So I find when I share stories like this with people, even if they're very skeptical about anything they consider as being mystical or spiritual, I just want, hardcore science. But if they are willing to accept the fact that these experiments have been replicated, that they're very well controlled, then at the least it makes them call into question their assumptions about how the universe is put together. That we do live in a universe where there can be effects at a distance instantaneously. This is called non-locality. And quantum physics has shown there can be effects that, this is called retrocausality, where something that you do today is having an effect on something that's already happened in the past. And it's not like it's traveling back in time, and there's all kinds of theories to explain how this might work. But just like we're all under, or most of us are under the assumption that the world is the way that it seems to be through our physical senses, we are also under the assumption, which we don't think of as an assumption because it seems like, well, how could it be anything but this, that time is only flowing in one direction, in the arrow of time from past to present to future. But if you study any of Einstein's writings, he talks about frames of reference. And in actuality, and this was a hard one for me to grasp when I was at Caltech, that there is no preferred frame of reference in the universe. So to one observer, it seems like to us, we're moving ahead forward in time, but to another observer in a different frame of reference, it seems to them like we're traveling backwards in time. And to us, they're traveling backwards in time. And nobody can say which one is right. There isn't one that's right. It's all relative to each other. Okay, so I think if I was going to give a definition of what awakening means, one would be awakening to the realization that we live in a totally interconnected reality where there's many dimensions of existence beyond the ones that we're normally capable of perceiving, and that everything is in relationship with everything else in existence. So I would like to pause here and have some time for any questions or comments that you may have, or any thoughts that this has triggered in you. So if you're visible and you want to ask a question, make a comment, just hold your hand up and Doug will unmute you. If you're, well, if you're on the phone, I guess we could just unmute people and ask you to try to be very quiet. If you, at least Doug, maybe you could unmute the people that are just on the phone and not the camera. And if you're on camera, just hold your hand up if you want to say something. Yes, Virginia. So, Doug, could you unmute her?
I will do that.
And Virginia, if you would speak up, because it was kind of hard to hear you before.
There she is.
Okay, I just kind of wonder, instead of 23 dimensions, maybe each individual has their own dimension, and they're all connected one way or the other. And that's, we suspend time and space here.
Could you say that again? I could barely hear you.
Okay, I kind of wonder if everyone doesn't have their own dimension and their own truth, which I have issues with that word, and that all these dimensions are totally connected, disregarding time and space, and we're all just here.
Okay. So are you asking, do people have a different set of dimensions, or do we all have those multiple dimensions?
We all have our own individual dimension. In other words, we have our own connections with the universe, because we don't see everything the same.
Okay, that is a wonderful question. In fact, a great Sufi mystic named Ibn Arabi said that each of us is really our own universe, and each of our universes has its own unique laws of physics. Well, I would give another answer to that too. You may have heard, are you probably familiar with what a hologram is? If you have a hologram and you cut off a little piece and you put the right reference frequency of light on it, it'll reproduce the whole thing that it's a hologram of. So if you had a hologram of a face, you could cut off a little piece and you could see the whole face in that little piece. It wouldn't be quite as clear. So a lot of people think that our universe is holographic, that every part contains the information of the whole rest of the universe. And I used to think of this as, well, okay, it's going to be the same no matter what little piece you take. But I come to the, let's see, Doug, maybe you can mute everybody now.
Yeah, I think I will. Go ahead.
Okay.
Oops. I've got to unmute you, my friend. Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I believe now is that, yes, we do live in a holographic universe, and it's true that each part has the connection with everything else in the hologram and access to the knowledge, potentially, of everything else in the hologram. But the way in which we experience that and the way in which we relate to that is totally unique for each being in the universe. So to me, spiritual awakening is a process of learning how to modulate higher octaves, so to speak, of our way of relationship with everything that we experience, and a way of relating that's not dualistic, where we're not over here and that's over there and we're looking at it through a telescope or a microscope or whatever, but we're having a deeply interconnected experience in which we're very much who we are, and whatever we're relating to is very much what or who it is. But there's kind of this permeability. I call it, I have a term called relational unity. And that way of, not only that way of relating, but what's revealed through that connection is unique for each individual, but it's also unique in every possible combination of whatever it is that we're relating to. So if I'm having a deep way of relating to one of you, let's say, some other time we're meeting each other in person and we get into a very deep conversation, and you've probably had experiences like this with friends where you forget about time, and you both come up with inspirations that neither one of you would have thought of on your own. The Sufis say that when two things are very much present to each other, a third presence arises from that relationship. And so what I'm saying here is what emerges from that particular way of combination of those two people is going to be totally unique. And then you could have two other people and that will be totally unique, odd, forever. Some people, there's a computer scientist at MIT named Seth Lloyd, and he had an article in Scientific American in which he postulated that, one, we live in a quantum universe that's really a gigantic quantum computer, pretty far out idea. And then he said, well, what is the computer calculating, or what's it trying to do? And he said it's computing itself. Basically, another way of saying it's seeking to understand itself. Well, this is the same thing that the Sufi mystics have said why there's been a creation in the first place. It said that the divine was a hidden treasure desiring to be known. So whatever terms that you want to put in there, we do live in a universe which is continually self-organizing to higher states of being and awareness and consciousness. And we could look at our own physical universe that about 13 billion years ago started out in this infinitesimally small, can't even, singularity, and in an instant burst forth with the Big Bang and brought forth the stuff after it cooled off enough to become our physical universe. Well, over 13 billion years, it's emerged to the point where there's humans who can be asking questions like, why are we here and what's this universe about, and so on. So the universe is self-organized to have beings, and I'm sure we're not the only ones here on this planet Earth to have a higher order of understanding. Okay, other questions?
What I've done, Dr. Don, since my driving skills are still in the learning phase, is I have allowed everyone to unmute themselves, but please raise your hand if you're on camera and we'll call on you. And if you're not on camera, just softly speak that you would like to make a comment or that you have a question.
Yes.
Yes, Reverend Lilia, unmute yourself.
Just click the microphone. You have to.
Here, I can help too.
Okay. There we go. Okay.
So this is a personal question for you. What did attract you so much about the Sufis?
What about the Sufis?
What attracted you so much about
what attracted me? Okay, well, I had studied many different spiritual traditions. I mean, in-depth Buddhism and yoga and so on. And when I came across the Sufis, one thing that attracted me is that, well, the word itself means wisdom. And over the centuries, the Sufis have always recognized the teachers of all the different spiritual traditions. So it wasn't like we've got the goods over here. In fact, the Sufis say that anyone who is a sincere seeker of truth is a Sufi, whether they call themselves that or not. But that was very appealing to me, the universality of it. And the particular, I studied with a great teacher named Hazrat Inayat Khan, who was very much into science as well as spirituality. And I mean, it was really about an evolutionary spirituality as opposed to here's this fixed body of wisdom and we're just going to teach it to you, and that's the way that it is. And it very much honors the uniqueness and individuality of each person. So that was very appealing to me.
Anyone on the phone might have a question or a comment? Okay, Stephen, I'll let you unmute yourself.
Click your microphone, Stephen.
I thought
There you go.
I thought I'd click it, sorry. Niles, I don't have a question right now, but Niles wrote something on chat.
Okay.
So maybe you can check that.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could spell the teacher that you studied with, what your
PIR, and then VILAYAT, and then KHAN, Pure Vilayat Khan, Inayat Khan, or just Khan. He's written many books and just an incredible teacher. You can find videos of talks of him on YouTube. In fact, one of the books that I have written called Upgrading the Operating System of the Soul, the Manual of Quantum Sufism, he wrote a 4-page foreword to that book. It's just an amazing teacher.
So I'm curious about how you would see this playing into, because for me, I feel like what you're speaking about is my reality. I feel like I play in these dimensions quite often, and to see into those spirit worlds comes easy. It's more integrating it into this reality, and actually even more so the language, having the language to be able to talk about it. So I really appreciate the language of physics to be able to talk about the layers of reality happening all at once. Acupuncturists and herbalists.
Your voice was kind of breaking up, so I couldn't hear the end of what your question was.
So my question is how do you see these other dimensions playing out in one life?
That's what mystics have been saying for a very long time, that all of us have our existence in these multiple levels of reality, which in mysticism are called subtle realms or higher planes and so on. And they're just like we have different names for the different colors in the spectrum, they have different ways of trying to parcel out these subtle dimensions. But all of us have our existence in these multiple levels, but our capacity to do anything with it is very dormant. I mean, it's not there normally, and it's not doesn't just hatch spontaneously. Most of it, occasionally in a rare person, they'll have an experience or naturally be inclined to be able to access that. But we can learn through different spiritual practices how to awaken our consciousness on these other levels on which we already exist. And I used to think the point was just to zoom our consciousness up to one of these higher realms and hang out there because it's really far out and enjoyable. But I came to realize, well, that's just a part of who we are. And really what it seems the goal is to be able to experience ourselves as a unitive being who is multidimensional in nature, and to be able to experience a full circulation throughout all the levels on which we exist, and to experience that no place else but right here. So here is not just the usual experience of physical reality. Here is an opened up reality that is so much richer than the limited world that most people are in because of the filters on their consciousness. And when we can operate from that level, just like in Tiller's research, linking the subtle to the physical opened up new possibilities. It was actually bringing about more order instead of a decay in order. I think we're actually bringing about a transformation in existence by doing that, as is everybody else who is working on themselves to be able to access more subtle states of being. We're actually transforming the experienced realm of reality in which we dwell by being able to do that. But it's very important to be able to maintain a a state of being firmly grounded in the midst of life and not have what Pure Light would call the spiritual bypass, which is like, well, I don't want to deal with the junk going on down here. I'm just going to bliss out in the higher realms. To me, that's not at all useful. We'd like to achieve this integrated state of being. And it's what the Sufis call awakening in life. And yes, William.
Something that I found challenging over the past 2.5 years as I've kind of started on this path is we're kind of conditioned to look for results, and you're kind of putting this energy into something more subtle and having subtle experiences, and you're working with intentions, and you're trying to find a way to serve, and just I find I kind of get stuck in I feel like I have to kind of be vigilant that I'm not kind of getting stuck in ego bubbles, that I'm kind of imagining that I'm doing something. I guess it's something so intangible. I just sometimes it could be not confusing, but just it could be hard to know if you're making progress, if you're doing something.
Well, across traditions, it's very helpful to have a guide in whatever path that you're pursuing who can help you navigate landscapes of consciousness until you reach the point of being able to kind of blaze your own trails. And it's very, very difficult to do it on your own devices because it's a matter of overcoming lifelong conditioning in our thinking, in our way of patterns of experiencing emotion, in our ways of relationship. And we can't get there as just some add-ons, linear add-ons to our usual frame of reference or way of understanding. And this will be the topic for another one of these video sessions, being able to enter into quantum leaps and go through discontinuities. But that's as much as I can say about that right now. And someone else had, Judith, did you have your hand up, or who had? Yes, Judith. And then Lee. Let's see. Judith.
Yeah, I'm going to help her unmute once I can find her on here. Oh, there you are. Okay, Judith.
Okay, Judith.
Go ahead.
All right. 2 questions. One, as you are advocating that spiritual awakening is a service to humanity, is it also a service to the divine? And that sounds pretty elevated. And my question is there a plan that we enhance when one awakens?
Oh boy, a quick answer and then more another time. I believe that all of existence is moving to a higher state of self-organization and wisdom, and that includes the way that we usually think about what the divine is, as opposed to this notion of this unchanging, static divine being that's unaffected by what goes on in manifestation. Again, I can't do justice to this question in a short answer, but I think there's a mutual co-evolution between what's in manifestation and what's transcendent to manifestation, including that in ourselves, which is manifest and transcendent, that those two in relationship with each other are each enhancing the other, and what emerges from that is something that could only take place through that relationship. And what emerges is unique for each person, and when more and more beings wake up to their possibilities and potentialities and be able to achieve that kind of connection with each other, now there becomes many more things possible to take place in manifestation than could occur before by the efforts of however many individuals operating from a separated dualistic state of consciousness. So that's the best I can do for right now. And Lee, you had a question?
No, I didn't. I'm sorry. That was my cat's tail.
Oh, okay. Was that Schrodinger's cat? Or?
Yes, yeah.
A message from the universe.
Anybody else? These are wonderful questions. Yes, Virginia, you have to speak up.
Let me help her unmute, it looks like. Okay, go ahead.
Shared my cat with Lee. In case you saw my cat.
Oh.
Silly, but we have to laugh sometime. But yeah, I think that if you get spiritually awakening, you want to be able to share that with others, even on a very small one-on-one basis.
Yes, and in addition to that, just like in Tiller's research, I don't think this little bit of circuitry was consciously thinking, hey, here I go bringing more order into this laboratory. That was just a natural property of that linkage of the subtle and the manifest. So to the extent that we awaken our capacity to bring subtle levels of our being into connection with our physical self, it's going to have a naturally transformative effect on everything around us. And it's not a matter of us trying to do anything or send out something. It's just a natural property of being in that state of beingness. Anybody else? We're coming towards the end of this one.
I have a quick question. Someone else doesn't have a question.
Yes.
What does doingness look in the state of beingness? What does doing look like in the state of being?
Your voice is kind of getting drawn out, so it's hard to understand. Say it again slowly.
Does doing look like in the state of being?
What do we look like in the state of being?
If I can, I think what I heard was, what does doingness or doing look like in the state of being or beingness?
Well, I'm reminded of someone asking the Buddhist, what is enlightenment? And he said, before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. During enlightenment, undescribable. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. So I don't know that you can say what you're doing looks different, but it's your way of being changes. And Hazrat Inayat Khan, this was another thing that attracted me to Sufism, said that the purpose of spirituality was to enable us to become natural human beings. And I think we look around, we've gone a long ways away from what's natural. And natural is to be able to fulfill all the potentials that we have within us, but they don't just kind of pop out on their own. And this is why spiritual practices are so helpful, regardless of what tradition you might decide to take them from. And there's so many, I talked about this last time, wonderful practices for working with consciousness that come through all the different mystical traditions that are effective and don't necessarily require the belief system that they arose from. I mean, they're like technologies of consciousness. And so if you want spiritual awakening to really be service to the world, then it takes some work on ourselves to help ourselves get into a state of consciousness and beingness where that becomes more our natural state of being.
I'm going to jump in as we close here because we only have a couple of minutes left. And I guess what maybe based on some of the things people have asked and talked about, and I'm guessing you'll be talking about this in future sessions, and we will be meeting again next Tuesday, same time. I'll keep practicing my driving skills. But I guess the question that seems to be, if I'm spending a lot of time in non-ordinary states or transcendent states, how can I use this experience of being in transcendence to apply it to ordinary reality?
Ah, what a wonderful question. I'll give a short answer to that. Initially, Pure Light had this wonderful term toggling. So we're in our usual consciousness, and then we have an experience of a subtle realm, and we've toggled consciousness into, let's say, the angelic realm of existence, or some subtle realm, and then back. So it's kind of like back and forth. But eventually, we can become capable of experience instead of like separate notes on an organ, it's a chord. It's all present at the same time, and each part is having an effect on the other, and it no longer seems to be an extraordinary state of consciousness. It becomes more and more a normal state of being, but it's a state of being that is so much richer than the way that we used to be in our ordinary limited state. It doesn't seem to be out there or spaced out or whatever, and there becomes less and less of a discrepancy between our inner and outer states of being. And usually there's a huge dichotomy. I mean, in spirituality, there's such an attraction towards the inner realm, and then, you know, you've got to put up with what's on the outside in life. But to me, the goal is to try to arrive at a place where it's just all part of the nature of who we are and how we function in the world.
Thank you, Dr. Don, for another interesting evening. And I just want to remind everyone, uumystics.org. You can find the recording there. And there's also, the recording will be available also on YouTube. And did you have any last comments, Dr. Don? I
would welcome if anybody has questions or comments. If you go to the uumystics.org and you click on this series, there's a link for this series of talks, and then there's a place to put comments where you can put questions in there too, and I check that pretty often, and I would welcome questions you have that I may not necessarily be able to give a detailed answer on the blog, but I will certainly consider them in what I present in the 2 sessions that we have left. So I would really welcome your questions or comments there. So,
thank you all for being here, and I appreciate your presence. Namaste, and may all journey in well-being and joy. Until next time.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.